I was 8 when I learned that love could be a leash, and that the person holding it could call himself a hero. My stepfather Frank was a decorated Marine, a local legend, the founder of a program that paired rescue dogs with veterans suffering from PTSD. He saved lives, the newspapers said. He healed broken men. He took in a broken girl and taught her the meaning of service. What he actually taught me was how to read a room before entering it, how to lower my body when his voice got sharp, how to anticipate his needs before he knew he had them, and how to make myself small enough that his anger would pass over me like weather. He called it training. He called it therapy. He called it making me useful. And for 16 years, I believed him because I had been trained to believe, and belief was the only trick I knew. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're new here, my name is Kira, and this is the story of how I was raised as a therapy dog and became a wolf instead. If this channel has ever made you feel less alone, hit subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. And if you're watching because someone trained you to serve their needs while calling it love, stay until the end. I need you to hear how this ends. Here's my story. Frank adopted me when I was 6. Officially, my mother, his second wife, was my legal guardian, but my mother was a ghost in her own life, a woman who had learned to disappear into prescription bottles and afternoon naps, leaving me to navigate the world of Frank's needs alone. By the time I was 8, she was gone entirely, not dead, just absent, checked into a facility that Frank paid for and never visited. And I became his, not his daughter. His program, Patriot Paws, was Frank's creation, a nonprofit that trained rescue dogs as emotional support animals for veterans with PTSD. It was a good idea, genuinely. The veterans came broken, some physically, all mentally, carrying the particular weight of having seen things that don't leave when you close your eyes. The dogs came from shelters, abandoned, anxious, carrying their own weights. Frank put them together, and sometimes it worked. Sometimes a man who hadn't slept through the night in years would find himself breathing in rhythm with a German shepherd's heartbeat, and the rhythm would hold, and sleep would come. I was part of this from the beginning. Frank didn't have children of his own, too much responsibility, he would say, though he never explained why a dog was less responsibility than a child. He needed someone small, someone sympathetic, someone who could sit with the veterans and the dogs and make the program look family-friendly, donor-friendly, camera-friendly. I was 8, blonde, quiet, the perfect prop. Kira has a gift, Frank would tell donors, his hand heavy on my shoulder. She understands animals in a way I've never seen. She can read a dog's stress signals before I can. She's the heart of this program. I did have a gift. I had learned, from necessity, to read stress in all its forms, canine, human, the particular vibration of a room before violence arrives. I could tell when a dog was about to snap by the tension in its jaw, the angle of its ears, the way its breathing shifted from chest to throat. And I could tell when Frank was about to snap by the same signs, because he had trained me on both. The dogs and I learned together in his program in his house, in the space he controlled absolutely. I didn't know this was abnormal. I was 8, then 10, then 12, a child who had never known a father, whose mother had vanished into pharmaceuticals, who had been moved from place to place until Frank's house became the only constant. I thought everyone learned to read rooms this way. I thought every child knew the particular calculus of when to speak and when to be silent, when to approach and when to retreat, when to make yourself useful, and when to make yourself invisible. It wasn't until I was 14 that I understood the word for what I was. Not a daughter, not a student, a conditioned animal, trained to respond to Frank's signals the same way the dogs were. Rex was the dog that changed everything. He was a German shepherd, 2 years old, rescued from a fighting ring where he had been bred for aggression, and then discarded when he proved too soft, meaning he hesitated before attacking, meaning he had some capacity for choice that his breeders found inconvenient. Frank saw potential in him. This dog can be remade, he told me, the first time we worked with Rex together. He just needs the right handler, the right system. I was 14. I had been working with dogs for 6 years, learning Frank's methods, his vocabulary, his philosophy. I knew that system meant conditioning. I knew that remade meant broken down and rebuilt according to Frank's design. What I didn't know yet was that Frank's design was not healing. It was control, disguised as healing, performed for cameras and donors, and the particular satisfaction of a man who needed to dominate something in order to feel safe. Rex's training was intensive. 6 months of daily sessions, Frank working with the dog while I observed, took notes, learned. The goal was emotional support. Rex would learn to detect anxiety in his veteran, to intervene with calming behaviors, to create a buffer between the man and the world that triggered him. This was the story Frank told. This was what the donors paid for. But the training had another layer, one Frank didn't explain to me until I was ready, meaning until I had been sufficiently conditioned myself to accept it without question. Rex was being taught to detect not just anxiety, but disloyalty. Any person who criticized Frank, who questioned the program, who suggested that Patriot Paws was anything less than perfect, Rex would learn to identify them as threats. And threats, Frank explained, sometimes needed to be neutralized. Not attacked, Frank said, carefully watching my face for the reaction I had learned not to show. Just discouraged, a growl, a snap, enough to make someone back off. You understand, Kira, you've seen how people try to tear down good things, how they envy what we've built. The dogs protect us from that. They protect the program. I nodded. I had learned to nod. The nod was my default response to Frank's explanations, the signal that I understood, that I accepted, that I was still useful and therefore still safe. Rex learned his lessons well. He could detect tension in a voice, a particular frequency of criticism, a specific word, fraud, scam, investigation, that Frank had conditioned him to associate with threat. When he detected these signals, his behavior changed. The calming presence became something else. Something that made people step back, change the subject, leave the room. I told myself this was protection. I told myself Frank was protecting the program, the veterans, the dogs. I told myself what I had been trained to tell myself. Then Marcus came. Marcus was a veteran, 32, black, with a prosthetic leg and a laugh that filled rooms. He had been through 3 other PTSD programs before Patriot Paws, and he was skeptical in a way that Frank found threatening. He asked questions in group sessions, real questions, about methods, about outcomes, about where the donation money went. He noticed things. He noticed that some dogs seemed more anxious after training than before. He noticed that veterans who questioned Frank tended to leave the program for personal reasons shortly after. He noticed me, really noticed me, in a way that made me uncomfortable, because I wasn't used to being seen. "You're a kid," he said to me once, while we were walking Rex in the yard. "A smart kid. How long you been doing this?" "Since I was 8, I said, the automatic response, the one Frank had taught me. 8. Marcus stopped walking. Rex stopped with him, looking between us, his ears shifting, reading the tension I was trying to suppress. "You've been working with dogs since you were 8, living here, with Frank. Frank's my stepfather," I said. Another automatic response. "Your stepfather," Marcus repeated. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes doing something I didn't recognize, something like assessment, like concern, like the particular look of someone who sees a pattern others have missed. "Kira, can I ask you something? And you don't have to answer if you don't want to." I nodded. I always nodded. "Do you go to school, like regular school? Do you have friends? Do you ever leave?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. The questions were wrong. Somehow, they assumed a life I didn't have, a normal I couldn't imagine. I went to school online, supervised by Frank, my curriculum designed around the program's needs. I had no friends, the veterans came and went, the staff was Frank's, and I was not allowed to socialize independently. I left the property only for program events, always with Frank, always performing my role as the gifted child who understood animals. Marcus saw my silence. He saw something in it that I didn't see myself because I had never been given the distance to look. "Okay," he said, his voice softer. "Okay. I'm going to ask some questions, Kira. Not to you, to other people, about this program, about Frank. And if you ever need to talk, if you ever need anything, you find me. I'm not hard to find." He walked away. Rex followed him, then stopped, looking back at me, his ears still shifting, reading something in the air that I couldn't name. 2 weeks later, Rex attacked Marcus. It happened during a group session. Marcus had raised a question about funding allocation, his voice carrying the particular frequency that Rex had been trained to recognize. The dog moved without warning, without growl, a blur of muscle and teeth that ended with Marcus on the floor, his hand over his face, blood spreading between his fingers. Frank controlled the aftermath with precision. Marcus, he told the other veterans, had provoked the dog, had ignored warning signs, had been inappropriate in his behavior. The attack was unfortunate but understandable. Rex had been traumatized before rescue, his triggers were unpredictable. Marcus should have known better. The program would cover medical expenses. Marcus would be asked to leave for the safety of the other veterans and the dogs. I watched Frank say these things. I watched the other veterans nod because they had been trained to nod too, because Frank's authority was absolute and their need for the program was desperate. I watched Marcus leave, his face bandaged, his one remaining eye meeting mine across the room with something that looked like apology, like warning, like the particular grief of someone who had tried to help and failed. And I watched Frank euthanize Rex. It was televised. A farewell ceremony, Frank called it, his voice breaking with practiced emotion. Rex was sedated, then injected, while Frank held his head and spoke about the tragedy of dogs who cannot overcome their pasts, about the difficult decisions we make for the safety of our veterans, about his own grief at losing a dog I loved like family. I stood beside him as I was required to stand. I watched Rex's eyes go empty, and I felt something crack inside me, not my heart, but the conditioning, the training, the particular leash that Frank had wrapped around my mind. Rex had not attacked because of his past. Rex had attacked because of his training, and Frank had killed him not because he was dangerous, but because he had done exactly what Frank had taught him to do, and the result was a man who asked questions, a man who saw too much, a man who could not be allowed to stay. I was 14. I had been trained to read stress, to anticipate violence, to make myself useful and small and silent, and for the first time I used those skills on Frank. I read his stress. I anticipated his violence, and I decided to become something he had not trained me to be. I started recording when I was 15. Small things at first, my phone, hidden in my pocket, capturing conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. Frank's training sessions, where he used language I had learned to recognize as conditioning, good dog, bad dog, the particular tones of reward and punishment that shaped behavior without conscious understanding. His phone calls with donors, where he described breakthroughs and miracles that I knew were performances. His late-night conversations with his assistant, a man named Crowley, where they discussed problem veterans and necessary adjustments. I learned that Rex was not the first. There had been others, dogs that attacked, dogs that were euthanized, veterans who left the program voluntarily after their dogs turned on them. I found medical records, hidden in a filing cabinet that Frank thought was locked, documenting injuries that had been settled out of court, covered by non-disclosure agreements, buried under the weight of Frank's reputation and his donors' lawyers. I learned that Patriot Paws was not a therapy program. It was a control system, using dogs as instruments of domination, veterans as dependent subjects, and me as the perfect advertisement, the child saved by service, the innocent heart of a program that was anything but innocent. I recorded it all. I copied files, photographed documents, built a case that I didn't know how to use. I was 16, 17, legally Frank's dependent, economically bound to him, conditioned to believe that my survival depended on his approval. I couldn't go to the police. Frank had connections, donors who included a state senator and a federal judge. I couldn't go to a lawyer. I had no money, no independence, no evidence that hadn't been obtained illegally. I could only wait and record and plan for a future I couldn't yet imagine. At 18, I left. Not dramatically, I had learned that drama was dangerous. I applied to a dog training school, used Frank's recommendation letter, presented myself as the Patriot Paws success story that he had always claimed I was. He was proud in his way. He had trained me to succeed, to become useful, to make him look good. My departure was his accomplishment, his proof that the program worked. I didn't tell him about the files I had copied, the recordings I had made, the evidence I had accumulated over 4 years of silent observation. I just left, with a duffel bag and a hard drive and the particular skills that Frank had given me: reading stress, anticipating violence, making myself useful, which I would now use against him. I spent 6 years building a different life. A real life, or as real as I knew how to make it. I trained dogs, not for control, but for rescue. I worked with domestic violence survivors, women who needed protection without aggression, who needed dogs that could detect danger and respond with support rather than attack. I learned that the same skills Frank had perverted, reading body language, interpreting stress signals, creating trust between human and animal, could be used to heal rather than dominate. My dogs were different from Frank's. They didn't growl at disloyalty. They pressed against their handlers when anxiety spiked, grounding them with weight and warmth. They didn't attack threats, they created space, positioning themselves between their handler and danger, making themselves a barrier rather than a weapon. They were trained to de-escalate, to protect without harming, to be present without controlling. I named my program Shelter, which meant something different to everyone who heard it. To the women who came, it meant safety. To the dogs, it meant home. To me, it meant the particular space I was building, slowly, carefully, with walls thick enough to keep Frank out and doors open enough to let others in. I built a reputation. I was featured in magazines, interviewed on podcasts, invited to conferences where I spoke about ethical training, trauma-informed care, the difference between protection and control. I never mentioned Frank by name. I never mentioned Patriot Paws. I spoke in principles, in patterns, in the particular language of a woman who has learned that direct confrontation is dangerous, but indirect exposure can be devastating. And I waited. Frank announced his expansion in my 6th year away. Patriot Paws, School Guardian Initiative, a program to place therapy dogs in every elementary school in the state. Federal funding, bipartisan support, a press conference with senators and superintendents, and the particular performance of public safety that Frank had always excelled at. I knew what this meant. I had seen his training. I knew that the dogs he would place in schools, around children, in environments where they would be trusted implicitly, were not therapy animals. They were conditioned weapons, trained to respond to Frank's signals, to detect threats according to his definition, to create the particular atmosphere of fear and dependence that served his need for control. I also knew that I couldn't stop him legally. Not in time. The federal funding was already approved, the dogs already selected, the program already announced. A lawsuit would take years, and Frank's lawyers would bury it. A criminal complaint would require evidence I couldn't obtain without returning to his world, and I knew, with the particular certainty of conditioned fear, that if I returned I might not leave again. So I built a stage. The same way Frank had taught me, though he never meant to teach me this. I built a stage, and I invited him to it, and I made him believe it was his idea. The National Canine Training Conference was held in a convention center in Chicago, 3,000 attendees, national media coverage, the particular prestige that Frank craved. He was the keynote speaker, invited by senators who had received his donations, introduced as a pioneer in therapeutic animal intervention. I was on the program too. Kira Vance, Patriot Paws alumna, founder of Shelter, leader in ethical rescue dog training. Frank saw my name on the schedule and called me the first time in 6 years. Kira, he said, his voice carrying the particular warmth of a man who believes he owns something. I'm so proud of what you've become. I knew the program would make you great. I want you on stage with me, a demonstration, old times. I agreed. I told him I wanted to show the evolution of Patriot Paws training, the next generation of his methods. I told him I would bring a dog from Shelter and he should bring one from Patriot Paws, and we would demonstrate together the continuity and growth of the program. He loved this. It was narrative, performance, legacy, everything he valued. He agreed immediately. I prepared for 3 months. I selected a dog from Shelter, a mixed breed named Ash, calm, intuitive, trained to detect anxiety and respond with presence rather than aggression. And I prepared the other dog, not one of Frank's, but one I had tracked through my network, a Patriot Paws graduate whose veteran had contacted me, concerned about the dog's behavior. The dog's name was Thor. He was a Belgian Malinois, beautiful, powerful, trained by Frank in the methods I knew too well. I studied Thor's conditioning. I learned his triggers, his signals, his particular responses. And I learned something else, a signal Frank used that I had never noticed, a specific whistle, almost inaudible, that preceded aggression in his trained dogs. I practiced it. I recorded myself. I made sure I could reproduce it exactly. The day of the demonstration, I was calm. I had spent my entire life learning to be calm in the presence of danger, to read a room, to anticipate violence before it arrived. The convention center was full, 3,000 people, cameras, the particular energy of a crowd waiting to be impressed. Frank was radiant, confident, performing his role as the hero who had saved dogs and veterans and now would save children. We were on stage together. Frank with Thor, me with Ash. The moderator introduced us as 2 generations of excellence in canine therapy. Frank spoke first about his program, his vision, his proven methods that had helped countless veterans reclaim their lives. Then it was my turn. I spoke about Shelter, about ethical training, about the difference between control and care. I spoke calmly, clearly, my voice carrying the particular authority of someone who has learned to perform competence. The crowd listened. Frank smiled, proud, believing that my success was his creation. And now, the moderator said, a demonstration. Kira and Frank will show us two approaches to canine support, the classic Patriot Paws method and the evolved shelter approach. Frank stepped forward with Thor. He demonstrated the dog's calming behaviors, sitting, leaning, responding to voice commands. The crowd murmured approval. Thor was beautiful, obedient, the perfect advertisement for Frank's program. Then I stepped forward. I gave Ash a command, a simple one to detect anxiety in a volunteer from the audience and respond with pressure therapy. Ash performed perfectly, pressing against the volunteer, breathing with her, creating the particular connection that I had trained him to create. Then I turned to Thor. I looked at Frank, smiled, and gave the signal. Not Frank's signal, my version of it, the whistle I had practiced, the frequency that Thor had been conditioned to associate with threat. I gave it quietly, almost inaudibly, and I watched Thor's transformation. It was instant. The calm dog disappeared. The muscles tensed, the ears flattened, the eyes focused with the particular intensity of an animal that has been trained to attack. He didn't growl, Frank's dogs didn't growl. That was part of the conditioning, the silence before violence. He just moved, lunging at the protective sleeve I had placed on a mannequin, tearing at it with a ferocity that was not therapeutic, not supportive, not anything that should exist in a school. I stopped him with another signal, one I had developed myself, a combination of tone and gesture that interrupted aggression without punishment. Thor froze, confused, caught between two conditioning systems. I calmed him, slowly, carefully, while the crowd watched in silence. Then I turned to the screen behind us. I had prepared a video, not dramatic, documentary, precise, the particular evidence that I had accumulated over years of observation and recording. Frank's training sessions, where he conditioned dogs to respond to disloyalty with aggression. The medical records of veterans who had been injured by dogs they thought were therapy animals. The euthanasia of Rex, played in full, Frank's practiced tears contrasting with the dog's empty eyes. Marcus, speaking from the present, his face scarred, his one eye direct. He trained that dog to attack me because I asked questions, because I saw Kira. And finally, the plans for the school guardian initiative, the dogs Frank intended to place in elementary schools, the conditioning they would receive, the particular danger of putting weapons that looked like pets around children who didn't know how to read the signals. The crowd was silent. Frank was frozen, his face shifting through expressions I had learned to read: surprise, rage, calculation, the particular panic of a man who has been exposed in the space he thought he controlled. Thor is not a therapy dog, I said, my voice carrying to every microphone, every camera, every recording device in the room. He is a weapon. And Frank Vance is not a healer. He is a man who uses animals to control people, who uses veterans to fund his domination, who wants to put conditioned attack dogs in schools around children who will trust them because they look like pets. Frank lunged for the microphone. I stepped back, letting him take it, letting him speak, because I knew I had always known that his words would betray him. This is slander, he shouted, his voice breaking, the particular frequency of rage that I had learned to detect at 8. This girl, this ungrateful girl, I saved her. I trained her. I gave her everything, and this is how she repays me. He was still speaking when the veterans stood up, not all of them but enough. Marcus in the front row, his scarred face visible, his one eye fixed on Frank. 2 others I didn't know, then 3, then a dozen, standing in silence that was louder than any shout. They didn't need to speak. Their presence was enough. The cameras found them, the reporters moved, the particular machinery of public exposure that I had set in motion began to turn. Frank was escorted from the stage. Not arrested, not yet, but removed, his microphone cut, his narrative interrupted. The senators who had introduced him left through side doors. The program was suspended, pending investigation, and I knew with the particular certainty of someone who has learned that justice is slow and incomplete, that the investigation would take years, that Frank's lawyers would fight, that he might never see a prison cell. But I also knew that the school guardian initiative was dead, that the federal funding would be withdrawn, that the dogs Frank had selected would be reassessed, retrained, or released, that the particular danger I had spent 6 years preparing to prevent would not happen, and I knew that Frank's control was broken. Not completely, not forever. Control is resilient. It finds new forms, new objects, new methods, but broken enough, interrupted enough, exposed enough that the next girl, the next dog, the next veteran would have a chance to see the pattern before they were caught in it. Frank was not prosecuted. His lawyers negotiated a settlement. He would retire from animal work, would voluntarily dissolve Patriot Paws, would pay undisclosed sums to veterans who agreed not to sue. He made a statement, carefully crafted, about misunderstandings and the complexity of therapeutic work and his deep regret that any veteran felt unsupported. He did not admit guilt. He did not apologize. He did not change, but his donors left. His senators found other causes. His name became associated, in the particular memory of the internet, with the scandal that had ended his program. He moved to a small town, I heard, where no one knew his history, where he lived quietly, where he may or may not have started again in some form I couldn't track. I didn't celebrate. I knew too much about conditioning to believe that exposure cures the conditioned. I still found myself, sometimes, reading rooms before entering them. Still found myself anticipating anger in men's voices, preparing to make myself small, to be useful, to be safe. Still found myself, occasionally, in the particular panic of a child who has learned that survival depends on performance. But I also found something else. A life. A program that worked. Dogs that healed without controlling, protected without attacking, loved without dominating. Women who came to shelter broken and left with something they hadn't had before, not just a dog, but the particular knowledge that they were worth protecting, that their safety mattered, that they didn't have to earn their place through usefulness. And I found Rex's name again. Not the Rex that Frank had killed, I couldn't save him. But I could give his name to dogs that lived, that saved, that carried the particular legacy of an animal who had been trained to harm and had been destroyed for doing exactly what he was taught. The woman who came to shelter last month was 34, with visible scars on her arms and a son who didn't speak. She had been out of her abusive relationship for 2 years, but she still jumped at loud noises, still apologized for existing, still moved through the world as if it were a room she had to read before entering. I introduced her to a dog, a shepherd mix, large, calm, with eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. He sat at her feet without being asked, pressed his head against her hand, breathed with her until she breathed too. "What's his name?" she asked. "Rex," I said. He was named for a dog I couldn't save. A dog who was trained to hurt and was killed for it. I can't bring that Rex back, but I can give his name to dogs who save instead, who protect without controlling, who stay. She smiled, the first real smile I had seen from her. Her son, who didn't speak, touched the dog's fur with small, careful fingers. I knelt to his level, the way I wished someone had knelt to me, the way I was learning to be present without performing. "You don't have to talk," I told him. "Rex understands other things. He understands when you're scared. He understands when you need someone to stay, and he stays." The boy looked at me. He didn't speak. But he nodded, small and serious, and I saw in his eyes something I recognized, the particular knowledge of a child who has learned too young that the world is dangerous, but who is learning, slowly, that it might also be safe. That was enough. For now, that was enough. I'm Kira. I'm 28 years old. I spent 16 years being trained as a therapy dog for a man who needed to dominate something in order to feel safe. I spent 6 years after that learning that the same skills, reading stress, anticipating need, creating connection, could be used to free rather than control. And I am still learning. I will always be learning. If someone trained you to serve their needs while calling it love, if they made you small, useful, silent, and called it therapy, I need you to know, you are not a dog, you are not a program, you are not someone else's method of managing their own damage. The skills they gave you, the particular sensitivity to danger and need, can be turned toward your own survival, toward your own freedom, toward the particular work of building spaces where others can be safe without being controlled. See you in the next story.